for jobs as the economy continues to accelerate. Accelerate under what conditions? Enormous, extraordinary, spectacular support from the federal government and from the Federal Reserve, in addition to what looks like an extremely successful vaccination program. Along with that, as I said, there is an enormous amount of forced savings that's sitting on the sidelines. Over the course of last year, consumers have been forced to stay at home, so they're not spending money on all the things that people normally spend their money on. So there's about $1.5 trillion sitting in money market accounts. So that's pent-up demand waiting to be spent. In addition to that, there's a little over $3 trillion in institutional money that's sitting on the sidelines waiting for the economy to show a clear direction and begin to recover. And so we've got a number of factors here. You've got a $2 trillion rescue package. You've got a $2 trillion infrastructure package. Plus you've got $4.5 trillion in institutional and retail money that's sitting on the sidelines, all of which is what? An enormous amount of firepower that's going to supercharge the economy in the third and fourth quarter. If the US economy is supercharged, what's the effect of that going to be on the rest of the global economy, a plus or a minus?
Plus.
That's going to be an enormous plus for the global economy. And we're already beginning to see that, because if you saw the indexes today, as I'm sure many of you did, we had a gangbusters opening this morning. I wanted to focus in on the labor market here, but next, let's take a look at some of the important data that came in last week while we were out on spring break. On Monday, we got the Case-Shiller number. The Case-Shiller Home Price Index is a summary of housing conditions in the top 20 real estate markets in the country, the 20 largest real estate markets in the country. It's considered a bellwether for housing throughout the country, like other barometers, other measures that we've looked at, like new home sales and builder sentiment, for example. Here we saw that the Case-Shiller number was up 11.2%. As the headline said, it's the highest gain in 15 years, with pandemic driving a rush into housing markets. So that's a very strong number that came in last Tuesday. On just after the Case-Shiller number, we got consumer confidence, which you see from the previous month jumped about 20%. Why is confidence surging? Confidence is surging for the reasons that we talked about. The economy is being stoked by extraordinary fiscal and monetary support, along with the successful vaccination program. All is leading to renewed consumer confidence. On Thursday, we got the initial jobless claims number, which spiked at 719,000 jobs, new claims, excuse me. The expectation is that that spike is an anomaly in what's going to be a trend towards a significant amount of job creation over the course of the next number of quarters. Finally, on Friday, we got the very strong non-farm payroll numbers and the unemployment rate, which came down. And the headline was that labor gains signal U.S. economy is primed for rapid expansion. And as I said before, if you looked at the markets today, look at how the markets closed. The domestic markets closed, whether the Dow, the S&P, the NASDAQ, or of course the global Dow, all had very strong openings on Easter Monday. Were there any comments or thoughts about this that anyone wanted to bring up? I made a note that last week on Thursday there was a meeting after there had been the 2 day after there was a conference with Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen made the point that the Fed will remain at full throttle. The Fed will remain at full throttle for some time to come. So the markets are assessing all of those barometers over the course of all of those signals over the course of the weekend. Comments being made by the Federal Reserve, by the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, the signal coming from the White House with regard to infrastructure, and taking all of that into consideration over the course of the weekend, and coming back today with a very strong signal of support in the equity markets. In terms of the anticipation of what can be accomplished over the course of the next number of months, with the full support of the federal fiscal and monetary policy, federal fiscal and monetary policy legislators in charge of the recovery. I'm just looking at some notes here I had with regard to velocity, but we're not going to talk about that now. Again, any questions here about some of the data that came in last week or anything that I missed? I know that builder confidence came down last week. One of the reasons is because lumber prices are soaring. Why are lumber prices soaring? Because of Trump tariffs that still remain in place. My understanding is the Biden administration is planning to roll back shortly. But in the meanwhile, lumber prices continue to soar and builder sentiment has softened. That being said, we know the housing sector is still on fire. We might be getting some pushback from consumers as prices continue to rise, but for the moment, it still remains a bright spot in the economy. If we look at oil prices, another takeaway from last week is what is the trend here we see in Brent and WTI. So in the global benchmark, the Brent oil market, Brent crude, and in West Texas Intermediate, what's the trend here in oil markets? Maria?
Positive. It's bullish.
Pardon me? It's bullish. Why is it? Why are the oil markets? Why is oil prices soaring? Why are they strengthening?
Demand's picking up.
Demand's picking up, and the expectation is what? That demand will continue to pick up because what?
The economies are
$1 trillion of government spending. You've got $2 trillion in a rescue package. You've got $4.5 trillion of institutional retail money sitting on the sides. You've got enormous pent-up demand. You've got no velocity in the dollar market, and everything is about to be unleashed. And so, of course, the understanding or the expectation would naturally be that oil markets would continue to strengthen, all of which has been a positive for the markets as a sign of the recovery. Now, let's finally take a look at the spread. Let's take a look at the yield curve. So, what's going on here in the yield curve? Well, so we've been comparing the 2 and 10-year spread, which is a barometer of risk in the markets from the short end to the long end of the curve. And so we saw that at the beginning of 2020, we saw that the yield curve was much, much higher, and the 2 and 10-year spread was at 30 basis points. And we've been tracking it since the beginning of the year. We saw that we started with a spread of 82 basis points. By this point, a year later, we're well into almost a year into the pandemic. What's happened? The short end of the curve is flattened, the long end of the curve is steepened, and continues to what? Do what? It continues to steepen. Yes? And so you see that today we ended up at a spread of 156 basis points. The 10-year came down to 173 today. Last week, I think it peaked at 175. I'm just looking at a note here. This past Friday on the 26th, the yield was at 167. So the yield had come down a bit. But even though the yield came down a bit from 175 to 169 or 167, excuse me, on Friday, what is the takeaway in terms of a historical perspective on interest rates, but on the 10-year specifically? And I'm asking you to look at the chart on the bottom of the page. What's the takeaway there, Andrew?
I'm sorry. The takeaway would be that we're recovering, I guess.
No, but that's okay. Thank you for the guess. Anyone wants to jump in there with a thought? What is the bottom chart telling us about
negative slope?
Interest about 10-year? Pardon me.
Sorry, it looks like the slope is very, very negative sloping. It's going downward.
Well, what it's
From
telling you
1980.
is that the long-term trend is that historically rates right now are very, very low. Yes, saying that historically rates are very, very low. Look at this. This goes back to 1960. And you see between 1960 and 2021, how many times have rates fallen below 175? Right now, they're 10-year rates fallen below 175. Right now, they're 173. Very few times over the course of all of these years. So even though there's concern about rising rates naturally as the economy expands and whether or not the Fed is going to either short circuit the recovery or somehow misstep, the truth is that rates are historically very low. That was the point of the chart. Are there any questions here?
Oh, Professor, isn't the Fed buying up inflationary tips? And wouldn't that skew the break-even rate
For the class,
investors?
What are tips? What are tips?
I believe that's like the end. It's like the end of the spread, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm completely correct on that.
Inflation protected securities.
You're talking about inflation protected bonds?
Oh yeah, yeah, those.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm like.
Okay. Well, right now we've seen a big sell-off in the bond market. Certainly a big sell-off in the bond markets. That's helped to That's helped to push yields higher as investors have reallocated their monies into other sectors of the global economy, with the expectation that there's going to be some type of inflation down the road. In terms of what the Federal Reserve is doing in terms of tips, I can't answer that question right now. What we know is that the Fed has made it clear that they're going to aggressively buy bonds to keep interest rates low when they need to, as we've seen from central banks around the world that have made clear, whether it's Germany or the European Central Bank or France, that they're going to buy government bonds in order to keep interest rates low. There has been coordinated central bank response to the sell-off in the bond market. We've seen rising rates to push rates lower. So that's my answer to your question in terms of tips. Tips for those in the class are inflation-protected securities that are issued by the Fed. Let's move on now. Okay, so in terms of new material, we're going to talk about quotas and other non-tariff barriers. Before we do that, though, I want to take a look at the schedule since everybody's here right now, or at least everyone that's going to be here is here. We're going to cover Chapter 5 on non-tariff barriers today, Wednesday, and next Monday. Next Thursday, we're going to have a quiz on quotas and other non-tariff barriers, and I'll give you more color about that, more information about that over the course of the next 2 sessions. But next Thursday, the 14th, we're going to have a quiz that will take the majority of the class. Pardon me?
Wednesday, the 14th.
Is that what I said?
You said Thursday. It's Wednesday.
Now, you know, the only reason I said that was to make sure that you were paying attention.
I'm paying attention.
Okay, so next Wednesday, on Wednesday the 14th, we're going to have a quiz. Then on Monday the 19th, we're going to start with Chapter 8 on regional trading relationships, and that'll take us the 19th and the 21st, and then the 26th. We're going to talk about regional trading relationships before we move on to some more hedging. We are going to do some more hedging this week. I'd like to introduce arbitrage tonight if we can, and on Wednesday, I'd like to take some time and talk about put options to go along with our toolkit that includes call options. But like I said, the next 3 sessions will be on non-tariff barriers, and then we're going to move on to a quiz next Wednesday. So we spent a lot of time now talking about tariffs, and now we're going to start talking about quotas. Quotas and other non-tariff barriers, which restrict, like tariffs, international trade. So we've got import quotas, voluntary export restraints, domestic content requirements, and subsidies, which we're going to cover over the course of the next couple of sessions. Just bear with me for a second. Under a tariff, what's the key here? Is that the domestic price can't rise above what? The tariff-induced price in order to remain competitive, right? There's a domestic price plus the tariff. If there's an increase in demand and domestic supply can't satisfy it, what happens under a tariff? Domestic demand increases, domestic supply can't satisfy it. What happens if there's an increase in demand?
There will be some imports.
There are going to be more imports. There are going to be more imports at the tariff-induced price. The domestic price can't exceed the tariff-induced price in order to remain competitive. Does everybody agree with that? Yes? I assume that that's yes. A general yes, right? So the tariff is restrictive, but it's not nearly as restrictive as a quota. What is a quota? A quota is a physical limit on the number of goods that can come into a country. So if there's an increase in demand, it doesn't matter. There are not going to be more imports. What will be the response? What will be the domestic response to an increased demand under a quota? It's going to be an increase in price, because under a tariff, consumers can buy an unlimited amount of a particular good at the tariff-induced price, but under a quota, they can't. So a quota, it's much more restrictive. So a quota completely forecloses, ends the possibility of market mechanisms working properly, okay, as opposed to a tariff where increasing domestic demand will lead to an increase in imports at that tariff-induced price. So we talk about quotas versus tariffs. We say that the quota restricts the import volume beyond free trade more than the import tariff for the reason I just told you, because the quota limits all imports above a certain number from coming into the country, okay? So the tariff increases the domestic price but can't limit the number of goods that are imported. So, excuse me, as we just said, under a tariff, the domestic price can only increase by the tariff amount, with consumers able to buy the unlimited quantities at the tariff adjusted price, as opposed to the situation under quotas, where the consumers aren't able to switch to imports because there's a physical limit on the number of goods that can come into the country. So welfare effects increase, and it encourages what? It encourages inefficient domestic production. So the overall welfare effect to the nation is much greater under a quota than it would be under a tariff. We're going to take a look at that. So we talk about absolute quotas, which is a physical restriction on the quantity of goods imported during the specific period of time. Like if the government says you can import 30 million cars over the course of the next 2 years, or 30 million apples over the course of the next 6 months. Okay, so what's the problem though with an absolute quota? Is it leads to higher prices, domestic production monopolies, and foreign producers that are unable to surpass quota limits. So what does the government do? The government allocates the right to sell in a quota protected market in one of 3 methods: the historic share of the market, the pro rata basis, or through government auctions. Now, it used to be that the government used the historic share of the market, which was prominent in the oil and dairy markets, but of course that's going to disadvantage new importers. And so therefore, it's no longer used, the historic share of the market. So the pro rata basis is much more common, where the importers receive a fraction of their demand. So a ratio of the import quota to the total quantity demanded by U.S. importers. So the example we use here is that if the import quota is 30 million apples and the demand by importers is 60 million apples, then the ratio is going to be 1/2 of whatever each importer demanded. Okay? By far the most popular method are government auctions. Why is that the most popular method? Can anyone tell us?
Government raises money.
Government raises money. That's right. That's called windfall profit or quota rent. Okay, so it's awarded to the highest bidder in a competitive market. And of course, because it's a competitive market, the bidding does what? It increases the price. And so the result of that is called windfall profit or quota rent. And that accrues to anybody that has the right to sell into a quota protected market, unless it's the government selling the licenses. We talk about a global quota, which is a specified quantity of goods that can be imported during a period of time without specifying any particular exporter or importer. What's the problem with a policy like that? Can anyone tell us? It's going to favor who? A policy like that, without specifying who can and can't export into the United States or import into the United States, disfavors who? Or favors whom?
Domestic.
Pardon me?
Domestic suppliers.
Not necessarily.
Favors the importer, I think.
Pardon me?
I think it favors the importer because they have a price advantage.
Okay. Okay, that's a great suggestion. I think the more appropriate suggestion is that it particularly favors large domestic importers and large foreign exporters that have the type of scale and market muscle to eclipse smaller players. It disfavors small players. That's what it does. So it favors large domestic importers and foreign exporters that are able to rush into the market and get their quotas filled, get their goods into the market before the quota is filled. A selective quota is an import quota that's allocated to specific countries. So you can have a global quota that says you're going to let in 30 million apples a year, plus a selective quota, which says 10 million to this country, 5 million to that country, 5 million to that country, so on and so forth. So the example we use is U.S. imposes an import quota of 30 million apples a year, 10 million from Mexico, 12 million from Canada, and 4 million each from Chile and Argentina. That would be an example of a global plus a selective quota. Pardon the noise, I have a window open. Are there any questions about this?
Professor, yes. Does that doesn't like also disfavor countries, because in a way like they're not like equally permitted to import. I don't know if you understand me.
You're saying,
Like they have different amounts. It's not like
in other words, is this discriminatory right here that you're saying 10 million from Mexico and 4 million each from Chile and Argentina?
Exactly.
Well, this I took from the, this was a policy that the government had a couple of years ago. Does it disfavor Chile and Argentina? I can see exactly why you would say that, but not necessarily, because it may be a function of what they're able to produce, what their productive capacity is. Okay. But the feeling is that a selective quota really takes the edge off of the problems of the global quota, which is why they're often seen together, global plus a selective quota that takes into consideration the productive capacity of each one of those exporting nations. But it's a very good question, a very good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's take a look at this a little bit more closely so we can get down to the granular detail of what the welfare effects actually look like. So here we see that under free trade, the U.S. is producing a pound of cheese. The U.S. is producing 1 pound of cheese. It's consuming 8 pounds of cheese, and it's importing 7 pounds of cheese. It's exposed to the supply curve from the EU at a constant price of 250. Okay, this is our equilibrium price and quantity right there. Now, we say that the US imposes a 3-pound import quota on cheese, and that's going to change the equilibrium price and quantity, as we've seen before with a tariff and supply and demand curves moving. What's the new supply? It equals whatever your domestic production is. In this case, it's 1 pound of cheese plus the quota, which is 3 pounds. So it's 1 plus 3 makes 4. We draw a line directly parallel to the existing supply curve, and we get the quota-induced U.S. supply curve. And now all we have to do is draw our lines, and we begin to see how we'll be able to identify the welfare effects. The price increases from $2.50 to $5. What happens? Domestic production increases to 3 pounds of cheese. Overall consumption falls to 6 pounds of cheese. Why? Because of the increase in price. But as you see, imports are at 3 pounds of cheese, right? Okay, so now we see that the quota allows domestic producers to raise their price to 5 pounds. And we see here are the various welfare effects. We see lost consumer surplus first is A plus B plus C plus D. We see the transfer of consumer surplus to domestic producers of import competing goods, like we saw with the tariff as a result of the increase in price. Excuse me. Next, we see the protective effect, which is a result of less efficient production replacing more efficient, less expensive foreign production. Now we see the consumption effect, which is a result of lower consumption due to the higher prices. And then finally, we see the windfall profit or the quota rent. Oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead there. Of course, as we saw before with the tariffs, your consumption plus your protective effect is going to equal your deadweight losses. So here, your deadweight losses equals $5. And finally, you have your windfall profit or your quota rent, which is as a result of quota-induced scarcity. And as we point out here, it accrues to whoever has the right to bring imports into a country and sell into a protected market. Are there any questions here? It's very straightforward, very much like what we did before with tariffs. Let's take a look. We have our lost consumer surplus because due to the price increase, our redistributive effect, our protective effect, our consumption effect, our deadweight losses, and our windfall profit or quota rent. Now, we want to assess the distribution of revenue between the EU exporter, the US importer, and the US consumer. It depends what position the exporters take and what position the importers take. So if we say that US exporters if EU distribution is determined by the price between these three groups. So if we say that if EU exporters organize on price and become monopoly seller against competitive US buyers, then the windfall profit or quota rent is going to accrue to whom? Can someone tell us?
To the EU spotters?
That's exactly right. So the EU buyers become monopoly seller against US importers acting as competitive buyers. The windfall profit is going to be captured by the European exporters, which represents a welfare loss for the United States. Now look at the complete flip side of that. If US importers organize and become a monopoly buyer against competitive sellers, well then the importers can buy at the prevailing world price, and the revenue effect is going to be captured by US importers, which means what's the welfare effect going to be in the US? There a loss to the US economy as a result under this scenario.
Only the deadweight loss.
Well, yes, but there's no real revenue, there's no real welfare loss to the US economy as a result of offloading the windfall profit or quota rent to exporters. Okay, so the US government collects the quota revenue by selling the import licenses and capturing the windfall profits, as we've said, which would otherwise go directly to the importers. Pardon me. So let's take a look here. We compare the effect of the tariff to the quota. So what do we see here under the tariff? At free trade, under the before the tariff, we see at free trade the price for a car is $6,000. The nation is consuming 8 million cars. They're producing 1 million cars. They're importing 7 million cars, right? The tariff of $1,000 car does what? It encourages domestic production, which increases from 1 million to 3 million cars. Overall consumption falls from 8 million to 6 million, and domestic imports fall from 7 million to 3 million as a result of the $1,000 tariff. If, as I'm going through this, anyone gets lost or has a question, please jump in. So
Yes, Prophet, I have a question. So, how do you get the 7 million over there, the imports?
because we said we said here, we said the nation is demanding 8 million, it's supplying 1 million, so it's importing 7 million.
Okay, I see.
8 minus 1. It's increasing domestic production as a result of the tariff from 1 to 3 million. Consumption falls from 8 to 6 million, and imports fall from 7 to 3 million. So if there's an increase in demand, what's going to happen? Exactly what we talked about before. An increased demand means that, well, there's going to be, if domestic supply can't satisfy it, there are going to be more imports, but at a price no greater than the tariff-induced price, which is $7,000. So an increase in demand leads to an increase in the number of imports, but the price is going to stay the same. The US price can't differ from the Japanese price by an amount that's greater than the tariff duty by the $1,000. So, as we said earlier in the session, with the tariff, the domestic adjustment to an increase in demand takes the form of an increase in the quantity of cars that are imported, not an increase in the price of the cars. Okay, this of course is going to be different, as you would expect, because we just talked about it under quota. So here we are under quota. Under quota, we're at the same place at time 0. We're at equilibrium, price equals $6,000. And domestic supply is 1 million cars, domestic demand is 8 million cars, imports are 7 million. Now a quota is imposed of 3 million units. Well, what happens? Well, domestic production increases to 3 million, plus the 3 million quota brings you to 6 million. So here's your equilibrium P and Q after the quota is imposed, which puts you what? Exactly in the identical position as you were under a tariff. Okay? So with a quota of 3 million units, you're in exactly the same position as you were before. What's the big but here? The big but here is what happens if demand increases? Well, if demand increases under a quota, well, then what's going to happen is that price increases to 7,500. Overall domestic production increases to 4 million cars. That leads to an overall consumption of 7 million cars, because you have the 4 million plus the quota of 3 million, which brings you to your 7 million. Okay, so the domestic adjustment takes the form of rising prices and increased production.
Domestic
Everyone see the
production, right?
difference. What's key for you here, what's key for us here as we talk about tools, industrial policy tools that governments use to restrict trade, is that you understand the difference between the quota and the tariff, that the quota is much more restrictive as opposed to the tariff, and what the difference are on the domestic adjustments. In addition, of course, to being able to identify the welfare effects, which we're going to do now. So we say that, was there a question there? I'm sorry. Okay, so
No,
we
in the
talk
graph.
about, now we're going to talk about a tariff rate quota. Tariff rate quota shows characteristics of both a tariff and a quota. Yes, because under a quota, you can't import more than what's the amount that's specified. But with a two-tier tariff, imports can exceed the quota limit because you have two tiers. You have a within the quota tariff rate and you have an above the quota tariff rate. The big problem, though, with two-tier tariffs is that often the above the quota tariff rate is often prohibitively high, much higher than the within the quota tariff rate. So we say many over the quota tariff rates are prohibitively high that effectively exclude imports in excess of the quota. Unfortunately, that often affects poor countries that are looking to sell their agricultural products into the US market. As we've talked about, that's one of the flaws, weaknesses in the US trade policy. So as we said, allows a specified number of goods to be imported at the within the quota tariff rate. Imports exceeding that maximum value are subject to the over the quota tariff rate. The system is based on a license on demand allocation. There are two techniques. There is the first come, first served basis if the demand for licenses is less than the quota. If the demand for licenses is greater than the quota, then the import volume is reduced proportionately, or licenses are sold at auction, much like we saw before with a straightforward absolute quota. Okay, so either first come, first serve, it's reduced proportionately, or its licenses are sold simply at auction. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the consequences of protectionism, and we talked about US sugar policy and how protections have been placed since the 1930s to protect a relatively small amount of large sugar farm owners here in the United States, to the detriment of poor countries that would like very much to be able to sell their sugar into the US market. I wanted to continue that discussion here. We talk about the US trade policy for sugar, where the US government applies tariff rate quotas on imported sugar using the two-tier tariff system. So again, we have a classic example of very concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. We've got enormous benefits for a small number of sugar growers and refiners, with the cost spread across the economy. As we pointed out last week, the US price of sugar is always greater than the world price of sugar, which affects producers and consumers alike. And because of the US policy towards sugar, we have the global market flooded with cheap sugar, which drives global sugar prices down, while US sugar prices remain artificially high. We have seen over the course of the last 30 years, many domestic candy firms like Mars, for example, and Hershey relocate their production abroad into lower cost markets. Any questions there on two-tier tariffs? Okay, good. So we talk about export quotas. An export quota, we have voluntary export restraints, which is when a government like Japan agrees to moderate the intensity of its exports, to moderate the intensity of global competition with, for example, the US auto market. So back in the 1980s, Japan agreed to limit its exports into the US market as a result of US pressure to do exactly that. Why would Japan agree to limit its exports into the US market? Can someone tell us?
Avoid higher tariffs on the cars.
That's exactly right, Alec. Thank you very much. To avoid a more significant punishment. So we point out here, the VER is the identical effect as a quota, except implemented by the exporting nations. The revenue, of course, is affected. The revenue effect is captured by the exporting nation. So why? Because it's an alternative to more stringent trade restraints being imposed by the importing nation. So in the 1980s, US and Japan agreed to a 3-year limit to car exports coming out of Japan. What was the result? The result was, as you would expect, that US consumers paid more and Japanese car companies profited. US consumers paid an average of $660 more per Japanese-made car and $1,300 more for each US-made car, for an estimated increase of $16 billion in costs for the US consumer during those 3 years in the 1980s. It's just one example of how export quotas have been used to support the domestic sector. Okay. Finally, pardon me. Yes, 44th, according to the Congressional Budget Office, during this period of time, 44,000 jobs were saved at a cost greater than $100,000 a job. We've seen similar examples in our work together of instances where tariffs were used, in this place quotas, but other trade barriers were used in order to protect domestic industry, and the result was much higher costs for domestic consumers. In fact, we talked about the tire tariffs under the Obama administration that led to significant cost increases, not only for consumers, but overall for the economy, to protect a relatively small amount of jobs. Okay, any questions on export quotas? Good. Very good. Okay. So we talk about domestic content requirements. A domestic content requirement requires that a minimum percentage of a good's value should be produced locally for zero tariff rates. What's good about that? What's good about that is it supports domestic wages by pressuring domestic manufacturers and foreign firms to use domestic inputs and labor. What's the problem with that, though? Can someone tell us, Nicole? In order to qualify for zero tariff rates, Nicole, you need to include domestically produced components. What's the problem with that? It supports domestic labor, but what does it also do? It forces you to do what?
Can I answer?
Well, since Nicole seems to be thinking about it, I'm going to let you go ahead and give it an answer. Give it a shot.
Well,
I am.
if the domestic
Nicole,
supply,
okay, go ahead. So you go ahead.
if the domestic supply is a significant price increase over the foreign supply, it might not be worth it to get the zero tariff if you have to pay a lot more for the domestic supply.
Is this Michael talking? Yeah, Michael,
Yeah.
that's great. That's exactly right. In other words, it prevents you from buying or sourcing cheaper foreign alternatives. That's exactly right. It prevents manufacturers from obtaining lower cost inputs, leads to higher product and input prices, lost competitiveness. So you've got domestic consumers that are subsidizing domestic producers through higher prices, which only increases the degree of inefficient production. So that was a great answer, Michael. Thank you. Any comments or thoughts or questions on this material so far? Okay, good. I'd like to now take a look at how how domestic content works in actuality. So here we have an example where we've got, under free trade, Australia is importing 500 Toyota cars at a price of $24,000 a unit. This is Australia's supply and demand schedule for cars. Okay, so we see that the income to Japanese owners, Japanese resource owners and manufacturers, is the 500 cars times 24,000 is $12 million. That's for Japanese resource owners. Now what happens is that Australia decided to impose a domestic content requirement on Toyota, and Toyota moves all of its production to Sydney. The price increased from 24 to 33,000, so a $9,000 price hike. Right away, you think, well, if Toyota moved all of its production from Japan to Australia, that's a big win for Australian resource owners. It's a big loss for Japanese resource owners, right? So let's see if we can map that out. So we say that Japanese resource owners are going to lose that income of C plus D. the lost income of $12 million. Now, Australian consumer surplus is going to decrease A plus B, which is 3.6 million. Why? Because the price went from 24,000 to 33,000. So A plus B just allows to quantify the welfare effect of that $9,000 price bump, right? And so we've got the cost of inefficient production, which is A, and we have the deadweight welfare loss for Australia, which is B, where we see the overall consumption falling from 500 units to 300 units. Okay. So C plus D, we've said that's the lost income of Japanese resource owners as the production shifts to Australia. Okay. Does anyone need me to look at that again?
Yes, please.
Okay, just to have a look at how domestic content requirement works and how it affects welfare effects. So we saw that at equilibrium, Australia is importing 500 cars at $24,000 a unit. That means Japanese resource owners are earning $12 million. We said as a result of domestic content requirement, Toyota moves production from Japan to Australia to satisfy the DCR. Prices increase from 24 to 33K, so a bump of $9,000. Overall consumption falls from 500 to 300. We know that Japanese resource owners have lost the $12 million. We also know that Australian consumers are paying $9,000 more a unit. We can quantify that as A plus B. So you have your cost of inefficient, which we break down as your cost of inefficient production, plus your consumption effect, which is your deadweight welfare loss for Australia, which is indicated by B. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome, Yamu. Okay, so we did that. And Australian resource owners, of course, are going to gain $9 million. Why 9.9 million? Because 300 units at 33K a unit gives you your 9.9 million. Okay. So that's all for quotas tonight and other non-tariff barriers. We're going to come back to that on Wednesday. But now I'd like to talk about arbitrage. So everyone get your calculators out and let's see if we can work our way through some currencies in our remaining couple of minutes. Okay? Just bear with me for a second and get out my notes. So we talk about cross rates. Sorry for the noise. We talk about cross rates, which are defined as the rate between two countries based upon their common relationship to a third currency, typically the US dollar. Why the US dollar? Because the US dollar is the most commonly used currency in the world and typically appears on 80 to 85% of every foreign trade transaction. So it's very common. So if we have the dollar against the Australian dollar trading at 1.4007, we have the base currency is the dollar, the quote currency is the Australian dollar. So the $1 US gets me how many Australian dollar? 1.4007. We've also got the direct quote of the dollar against the yen, which is 106.049. So now the question is what's the calculated cross rate? We can determine the calculated cross rate of $1 Australian into the yen, in yen because both trade against the US dollar. So what we do is set up a fraction. So how many times does the Australian dollar go into the yen? Well, we say 1.06049 divided by 1.4007 gives us Australian dollar yen 75.7114 as the calculated cross rate. We always calculate currency to the fourth decimal place. So we talked about early in the semester. Any questions here? How we calculated that? How many times does the Australian dollar go into the yen? Because they're common relations with the dollar, we can set up to a simple fraction. 106 and change divided by 1.4 and change gives us the 75.7114. Now, if you have the dollar against the Malaysian ringgit at 4.1567 and the dollar against the real, Brazilian real at 5.6157, what is the value of 1 ringgit in real? Can someone calculate that for me, please? Tell me what that is.
should it be 5.6 over 4.1?
Exactly right. 1.3510. Malaysian ringgit to the real, 1.3510. 5.6157 divided by 4.1567 gives you that answer. That's your calculated cross rate. Now, if your calculated cross rate isn't the same as the spot quote, what do you know? You know that there's a mispricing in the marketplace, which means that you have an arbitrage opportunity. Let's take a look. So, if the dollar against the real is 5.49, we know our base in quote currency. The dollar against the Swiss franc, 0.9415. The spot quote on the dollar against the real is 6.0935. Can someone tell me what's the calculated cross rate of the Swiss franc against the Brazilian real based upon the data you get at the top of the page?
I got
Should be
5.
around 0.8, 5.8.
So how did you get
5.8311.
5.8?
5.8311. So you
So
said
how did you?
5.49 divided by 0.9415 gave us 5.8311. Very good. Thank you. So now what do we have? You've got a mispricing. So we know there's an arbitrage opportunity that exists. If we do things correctly, we should come out with a return that's equal to the spread, the percentage spread between the calculated cross rate and the spot quote here, which is about 4.5%. So let's see. If we start out with principal of 7.5 million real, which is about 7.5 million real, what's that going to be in US dollar terms? Can someone tell us? If you have 7.5 million real and the spot quote is dollar real 5.49, you got to say 7.5 million divided by 5.49 to give you about 1.4 million. That's right. So we could sell with arbitrage. You have to start and finish with the same currency, and if you do it correctly, you should make this. You should make that percentage spread between the calculated cross rate and the spot quote. So let's look at this trade. We sold real in the spot market for dollars. So we said we divided the local currency by the local spot rate. 7.5 million divided by the 5.49 gave us 1,366,120. Now we took those dollars and we sold those dollars for Swiss francs, which we multiply by the local spot rate, multiplied by 0.9415, gave us Swiss franc 1,286,202. From here, we're going to sell Swiss franc back into Brazilian real. Yes? So to get from Swiss franc to Brazilian real, we say the 1,286,202 multiplied by the spot quote up here, 6.0935, gives us real 7,837,472. That gives us a profit of what? Of 337,473. How do we get that? We have an ending balance, 7,837,000 and change, a starting balance of 7,000,005 up here. They gave us a profit of real 337,472. What is that in dollar terms? We'll divide it by the 5.49, gives you 61,470, which equals about 4.5% on your initial investment, which is great. Are there any questions here?
Yeah, how often does it really happen in the markets?
Often enough that there are people that spend their entire careers as currency arbitrageurs looking for mispricings in the marketplace every day.
Does all transactions have to be instantaneous?
All transactions are very, in other words, the window here of opportunity is very small. I mean, it's not, it's a matter of, it depends how long how long the mispricing remains in place. But eventually the mispricing disappears. You're trying to take advantage of the opportunity while it remains in place. So in terms of, is it instantaneous? It's fast.
Because it's like taking money from the floor.
You're identifying a discrepancy in market pricing in different prices. I can buy a car in one market for 1,000. I can sell it in another market for 1,050. Well, on every trade, I can make $50. Well, the more I sell, the more I make. Here, you often find, arbitrageurs, they look for small mispricings. They can pour in a lot of money and exploit whatever the small price difference is to make as much money as quickly as possible. It's a very risky, high risk, high return.
Professor,
yeah.
Is there algorithm trading on the Forex market?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
And that's, of course, a major disruptor. All of that, high velocity trading, all of that's a major disruptor. Yes. For our purposes here, I want you to understand how arbitrage works. I want you to understand moving in and out of currencies. In terms of those types of broader questions, you're absolutely 100% right. Yes, those are big considerations, technical trading and those types of algorithms. That, of course, arbitrageurs use regularly in order to remain as competitive as possible in a very, very competitive market. Let's take a look at one more problem here, if we could. We've got the dollar against the ringgit, which was at 401 just recently. The dollar against the Danish krona, which is DKK, was 6.3. The spot quote of the krona versus the ringgit was 0.66. Can someone tell me what is the calculated cross rate of krona into ringgit? How many times does the krona go into the ringgit?
.6365.
What did you say? You said 4.01 divided by 6.3 gives you 6.6365.
Yeah.
0.6365.
Yeah.
So again, we've got a market or misprice. We've got an arbitrage opportunity. You've got $5 million in ringgit. Okay. So $5 million in ringgit is about what? It's about $1,250,000, right? So I'm asking you, the question is you've got ringgit 5 million. What's the potential dollar profit and the return on investment? So let's go through the same exercise. Sell ringgit for dollars. Now notice at the top of the page here, you have dollar ringgit and dollar krona. You're starting in ringgit and you're going to work your way around counterclockwise. You're selling ringgit for dollars, dollar for krona, and krona back into ringgit. Does everybody see that? You're moving counterclockwise. Ringgit to dollar, dollar to krona, and krona back into ringgit. Okay? So it's always like that. So,
Professor,
yeah.
would it also not work the inverse way if I went from, sorry, I forgot the name of it, but from DKK to US dollars, then from US dollars to MYR, and MYR to DKK?
In other words, if you started with principal dollars, if you started with dollar principal.
Yeah.
It shouldn't. In other words, the arbitrage opportunity is on the foreign currencies, not that, well, we're identifying the krona and the ringgit as the foreign currencies, not the dollar.
If you
If you started with Danish krona.
yeah, that's what I'm asking. Thank you.
No, I don't think it will work. It's a different trade, but we could certainly go through the mechanics of it. That's fine, but no, it shouldn't. Theoretically, no, it should not work. No, but let's look here. So we started with 5 million ringgit, so we're going to sell that for dollars. So ringgit divided by 4.01 means you've got 1,246,000 and change. We're going to sell that for krona times 6.3 gives us 7.8 million and change of krona. Now we're going to sell krona back into ringgit. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to say 7,855,000, multiply that by the 0.66, gives us 5,184,139. So what's our profit? Our profit is the ringgit 184,139. So divide that by the 401. That means our profit was 46,020, which means our return here was 3.5%.
Professor,
Yes.
what if you don't have the MYR, the ringgit, but you have dollars? How would you borrow from the ringgit?
I don't have ringgit. I see an opportunity in the ringgit krona market. What do? I might borrow the ringgit. It depends how cheap I can borrow the money for. If my credit rating is really strong and I can borrow the ringgit for next to nothing, then I would borrow the ringgit. I might give up a few basis points, 50 basis points. I mean, I might give up 50 basis points to borrow the money for a short period of time. Yes.
Otherwise, yeah.
How fast could the general you borrow? It depends upon, I mean, an arbitrageur who's working at the Morgan Stanley can borrow, light speed. A guy sitting at home may not have the same capacity, depending upon, who the guy is or woman is that's sitting at home. Guy or, woman that's sitting at home doing the trading. These tend to be very liquid markets. The more, again, it's a question of scale. The stronger you are, the bigger you are, the more flexibility you have. The better your credit rating, the more flexibility you have in terms of borrowing. If you're a guy who's running or a woman who's running your own book at home, you might be running a portfolio of let's say a reasonably sized portfolio. You've done everything right. You have a superb credit rating. You have a good relationship with your bank. You can borrow this money very, very quickly. And there are lots of ways to borrow money very quickly. So that's a long answer to a short question. Okay. Okay. So I'm sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Sorry, how did you get the 3.5%? I know how you get the 46,000.
Because I just said 46,020. Well, you took 5 million. 46,020 divided by 1,246,883 is 3.5%. Because the value in dollars of my original position is 1,246,883. You see that?
Yes, I see.
Another thing you can do is you could say, well, if the spot quote is 0.66, the calculated cross rate is 0.6365. It's 3.5% below what the spot quote is. So that means that if I do this correctly, I should get a 3.5% return. It's the same thing that we saw before. The spread was 4+% on the spot versus the calculated cross rate. If we do things correctly, that's what our return should be.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And so we're going to come back on Wednesday, and we're going to talk about domestic production subsidies, export subsidies, international price discrimination, and dumping. I'd also like to introduce put options to go along with our call options, and that'll be that. If there are any questions that come up between now and Wednesday, shoot me an email. Beyond that, I'm gonna turn that off. Beyond that, I'm very glad to see everybody. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for your time and attention this evening. I wish you all a good, safe continuation of your evening.